Forecasting is one of those things that every post-sale team says they've got totally dialed in until they miss the forecast by $1 million or more. In today's episode, I'm sitting down with John Huber, who is the founder of Customer Success Architects, and he shares a story where he was forecasting at 94%, feeling very confident in the weeks before the close, only to come in at 78%. And when this happens, you probably get one shot at a miss like that before the rest of the executive team starts thinking of you as the JV squad. Today, we get into what it takes to build a predictable renewal forecast. John's going to walk us through the 4 questions he requires every account manager and CSM to answer before a renewal hits the commit status. And these are budget, competing priorities, measurable outcomes, and what happens if the deal pushes. We also talk about churn forecasting. John has built a cross-functional cadence with product and engineering support and so on that meets every 2 weeks. And he shares examples of taking gross revenue retention from about 85% to 96%, which is a really big deal, and shows that churn like that is not necessarily an account management problem. It is a company-wide problem. So lots of really great stuff here. Let's jump in with John Huber. I hope you enjoy this episode of Account Management Secrets. If you're an account manager, you already know this. You're the one keeping the business running. You own the client relationships, drive the revenue, and solve the tough problems for your customers. But here's the challenge. Most companies don't give account managers the training or recognition they deserve. That's what you'll get here on the Account Management Secrets podcast. I'm Alex Raymond, and after working with thousands of account managers, I know what separates the best from the rest. In this show, we cover exactly what you need to succeed, handling tough client conversations, driving renewals and upsells with confidence, and proving your value every single day. There's no fluff, no outdated sales tactics, just real practical strategies you can use right now to grow your accounts and build a successful career. If that sounds like what you've been looking for, hit subscribe and let's get into it. Hey, John, great to see you. Welcome.
Hey, Alex, great to be here.
I've been following you for a while, and you put a post on LinkedIn recently. This is where I get a lot of stuff from LinkedIn. You put a post on LinkedIn the other day that really caught my attention, and you were talking about a situation where you were the head of, I think, customer success or account management, and you were talking about your renewal forecast. And in this post, you say, "Look, we were forecasting at 94%." We only came in at 78%. That was a $1.2 million difference. That's a big deal. That makes for a lot of awkward conversations. And you share a little bit about that, what that means. Yeah. But this got my attention because this is a real live example of something that is so prevalent out there in the post-sale world, is how to get good at sticking to our forecasts and building rigor and repeatability around that. And I know this is a topic that's important to you too. So let's just jump in here. Tell us what this was all about. Give us all the nitty gritty of the story here, and then let's back into some lessons from it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I love sharing these real world examples, and I've had many more failures that I've, had to learn from than successes. And that's my goal with sharing these types of posts and content. So, I remember this vividly. This was an organization where I joined to build out kind of the account management function. So the forecasting of sales, and particularly new logo business, that motion was already in place, but we were building a rhythm around forecasting business for the existing customer base, not only new revenue, but more importantly, renewals, and building a predictable, durable renewal forecast. And so when a lot of people think about renewals, you have a due date for the renewal. So you think, shoot, I'm going to be at 100% of my revenue target for every quarter, right? That's not the case.
Because money grows on trees. It's recurring revenue. It's just going to show up. I don't have to do anything.
The trees, and they're going to fall in your lap. And so, this was I used to run a pretty tight forecast and do a weekly cadence with my team. I would roll that up weekly to my CRO, which ultimately, goes up to your CEO, up to the board. And, when you have confidence and you speak with confidence for the first month of the quarter, the second month of the quarter, you've provided durability in your forecast in the past, what you tell your CRO and ultimately up to the board, they believe you. They're going to buy in on, hey, John and his team have proven this time and time again. Why would we not believe them? And
Yeah,
so,
they're going to take you seriously.
yeah. So this was a great example of where, I remember it was a busy quarter. We had probably 20% more in terms of volume of the renewals that we had. We had some big complex ones that we're dealing with some customer health issues with. But even 3 weeks out before the quarter closed, I felt pretty darn confident we were going to hit our number. And, we if anything, we might overachieve our number a little bit, right? And that was a mistake I made. And, I learned the hard way that, you really need to, you think you've got the story, you think we've got a great relationship with these people, you think things are going to fall your way and happen when they're supposed to happen. That's not always the case. And It takes misses at the end of the quarter, unfortunately, to learn that lesson and for me to put changes in place for the next quarter going on where, you're operating with that heightened sense of, sensitivity at the beginning of the quarter where you're asking all of those probing questions. What happens if this doesn't happen? What other priorities are competing with our priority to get this done? And so that was a tough learning. I mean, having that conversation with your CRO to tell them that, hey, this renewal that I've been telling you about for the last several months, that's going to happen is not going to happen. It's going to come in next week. That's a tough conversation to have.
So it still came in. It just came in late.
Came in late, yeah. So we missed for that quarter. And what's important to note in this too is we're a private company. We were working on another round of funding, and so showing predictability, you can imagine there's even more scrutiny on what we're doing, how we're operating the business. Luckily that came in a week later as I had planned, and we made darn sure that it would. But those are not fun conversations to have, and so it was a tough lesson learned. But we certainly got even more predictable going forward.
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing that you have. You basically have one life when it comes to this. Like you do this once, okay, maybe you'll survive it. You do it twice, you're not going to survive that.
Right.
As a general rule. And I think what happens here is if the rest of the executive team doesn't see the post-sale function as being able to commit to their number and being able to hit their forecast, then they start thinking, they don't really, this is not really being run that well, or this is the analogy I use all the time, this is the JV team versus the varsity team, they're just kind of a different group. And that has, number one, implications for the leader of the team, of course, whether you stay or not. But secondly, it can really just overall decrease the oomph that you've got within the company. Like people just, they will put less stock in you if they see that happening. And I think that's one of the big struggles that post-sales teams are having right now is, everyone's out there clamoring, how do I get a seat at the table? And how do I get more recognition, which are valid questions. But a big part of it is how professional are we approaching this stuff?
Right. You're absolutely right. And, when I used to think about forecasting, when I would build teams, oftentimes forecasting was a new muscle for a lot of the people on the team. And you really had to spend a lot of time and teach them, how the CRO thinks about it, because they're forecasting their business up to the CEO, and it's almost like a pyramid in the sense that, you're hedging your bets as you go up the pyramid and what you're committing to versus what's a best case opportunity. Right. And so I learned pretty quickly that, if I'm going to commit a deal or we're going to commit a deal or a renewal, we need to be 100% certain that is going to come in when we say it's going to come in. And, a lot goes into that. A lot of inspection goes into that. A lot of rigor goes into that, both with the customer and developing a close plan and all of those, best practices that, you and I both know work. But it's being consistent. Consistency is the key, because in that example that I shared, when you kind of lose sight of it a little bit, that's when things go sideways.
So what does it take to get really good at forecasting? What does it take to get it right?
I think it's a couple of things. I think for me as a leader of the team, I always had really strong directors that were on the front lines with the account managers or the CSMs. And so, it would be really trusting and understanding how do they think about the forecast, right? And how do they think about, and after you spend a couple of quarters with them, you start to understand how accurate they are, how they think about it. So what they tell me, I could go back and ask some more probing questions to really understand if we're going to commit $500,000 for this quarter, start to poke at that. How strong and sturdy is that? And so understanding how they forecast their business that rolls up to me is important, but also going to the team level and understanding, at the individual contributor level, who's accurate, who really understands that, who has happy ears, right? And, a customer just says, hey, we think we're going to do that this quarter. If that's all they're going on and they're committing a deal, we've got a lot more work to do to really ensure that that's going to happen. And so I've always been hands-on in the sense of really trying to get into the mindset of my team that's forecasting the business, but I also want to give them the room to manage their business. I don't want to come in and, try to overstep my bounds and run the deal for somebody. I want to let them do that, but I really want to understand how they're thinking about their business.
And what are the biggest mistakes that you see team members make when it comes to this process? So happy years for sure is going to be one of them, but what else?
Happy years is one. I think not having a clear understanding with the customer and having those hard conversations with the customer. So I'm a big fan of, putting a close plan together with the customer. This is something that I learned early in my career. And it's not about holding the customer accountable per se. It's about building a plan together, because just as you're forecasting this upwards internally, they're taking a new project or a renewal and they're taking that internally to get buy-in, to get approval, to make sure there's budget for it. And so you need to help them. And it's building that plan and giving yourself enough runway. So we used to build a plan for renewal 6 to 9 months in advance, and making sure that we had checkpoints and making sure that, they had what we needed. If we needed to engage one of our executives with one of their executives, that we had that time to do it and it wasn't a last minute thing. And if you're not, chasing paper at, 2 weeks before it's due, you're probably in trouble. And so I think those are some of the principles that, I had learned early on and then try to instill into the culture of my teams.
Yeah, definitely. I would say that, things that I've seen teams not be very good at are number one, not asking the tough questions, right? People don't want to hear no, or they don't want to hear like the business might be at risk. But frankly, the sooner you can get any bad news out there, the sooner you can do something about it. So it's, are you asking the tough questions? What I call relentless curiosity, right? Like, are you just out there hammering the customer? Don't take the first answer as the truth. Keep going. I would say that is super important. People are afraid of bad news. And, I had a guest recently on the podcast, Jim Richmond of Smartling, and he was talking about just get bad news out early, right? Like that's the idea. We're all going to get hit sometimes. Things are going to happen. There's a lot of stuff that's outside of our control, but if we don't know it's happening, that's a way bigger deal than something we can forecast and something that we know about. And then, the third one, to your point, is people just like ticking around, looking at their dashboard, and then, 30 days out, I guess I'll send them the renewal canned email that everybody gets or something like that, and it's like your customer has probably known for 9 months, maybe 12 months, maybe longer at this point, whether they want to continue working with you or not. Don't leave it to the last 30 days to find out. So when you were saying 6 to 9 months is, the process that you have there, what does that engagement look like? Because it can be pretty tough to come into an engagement with a customer, 9 months out and be like, hey, in January, we're going to be renewing and how, how convinced are you that you want to keep working with us can be a little bit
Yeah.
off-putting. So what are you actually doing in that time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I've had customers say that too. Like, my gosh, like that's so far away. Like we've got two other projects we've got to address before we get to that, right? Or we've got to solve for these issues. And so I've always taken a collaborative approach. Most of my experience has been with kind of mid-market and enterprise customers. And so I think they internally need that time to go through their internal process. And, it starts with, if you've had a good relationship with them and understand what's working, it's an opportunity to align to a plan that you've been working on, hopefully over multiple years, where you're building, like I used to call it a joint success plan or a joint,
Yeah, I love
account
that
plan.
term. I love that term, joint success plan. Yeah.
And it's really understanding their priorities and how you can support them, either from a services perspective, from a solutions perspective. And so as you're having those conversations and aligning to that joint success plan on a quarterly basis, that early renewal conversation is just natural. And it's, I used to always frame it up with customers like, look, I realize you're going to have to take this and you're going to need some time. The reason I like to start early is I want to make sure that you and I are on the same page. And we're going to present some options to you. I want to understand what's important to you. I want to understand if there's new products that you want to explore. You've got time to do that and you're not rushing, at the very end and, trying to let's make a deal. And so by giving them that time, that first couple of months is you with your stakeholders in the business to frame up, okay, here's the 3-year renewal option with these two products I think is going to work for us. And then they take that and they get that into the procurement loop. And that's when you start the internal conversations with them. And so, I mean, I'm sure you've worked with hundreds of procurement people. They don't like to be rushed. And
No.
so giving them the runway. And I think the other thing too is it's okay to sign it early. Like if I've had customers that have signed it 2 months before the renewal's up.
That's a great point. It does not have to be this crazy exercise at the end of the
Yeah,
quarter.
yeah, I completely agree. And so, I mean, I've spent, I've closed the quarter on New Year's Eve at New Year's Eve parties on the phone trying to get a deal over the line. I've done it on spring break, on the patio with my family at the beach, and I'm trying to get something done right before the Q1 ends. And, it's just the times you can get the early ones out of the way, I think attributes to that, collaborative planning with the customer. And I think they appreciate that. They don't want the stress. They don't want to play games to save a few $1,000. And I think if you can get that out of the way, it works. It solves so many things. And back to the forecast, it makes your forecast more predictable, right?
Sure,
You
because
have
then you
those.
got stuff baked in already, right? You're
Yeah,
already there. You're already halfway
absolutely.
there. I don't like it when we just assume, oh, it's embedded in there, or the customer has a contractual obligation to us, or what have you.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't feel right. Versus like, really, are we delivering value? Do we understand what the customer's trying to do here? Are we good partners together? Now, John, you've got a series of questions that you have since built around asking your team to make sure that they're aware. What are your 4 questions to make sure
Yeah.
that the renewals are coming in?
Yeah, I think it starts with the economic buyer, right? Do they have budget? Seems like a no-brainer. It's part of every sales methodology that's ever existed, right? And the funny thing is that is oftentimes overlooked, right? They'll assume they have budget because that renewal is in this year's budget. But as we know, budgets change. And so getting explicit, confirming they have budget. Do you have budget for next year? Right? Especially when the renewal overlaps, calendar years. It's also understanding, what other priorities are going on within your organization that may be competing with this renewal or this project that could put pressure on this getting done in the time that you think is accurate, right? And so, I think that is an important one as well. You touched upon it earlier, delivering value and delivering outcomes. And so I've seen a shift in organizations, particularly in the last 5 to 7 years, where they're really outcome focused, right? And they're really thinking about, okay, like we use it a lot, right? We've got high adoption, but are we getting the outcomes that we set forth to? Are we getting the outcomes that we're paying you $500,000 a year for it? So I think that's a question. And the last one that I would ask not only my team, but I would encourage my team to go ask, their champion at the customer is, what happens if this deal pushes, right? And I've worked in organizations where, hey, this pricing is good for this quarter, right? We're putting an incentive forth, to motivate you to sign this quarter. Well, if it signs April 2nd, what does that mean, right? And I've seen situations where we've held the line and that pricing expired. I've also seen it where, if we can truly get it done in 2 more days, we'll honor that price. And I think it's situational, but it's teaching CSMs and account managers to ask those questions and just have an honest conversation with customers. And I think by doing that served me well. That's helped me and my team become more predictable in how we forecast the business. And it's something that's just, I've learned, I've adapted the questions and the timing of the questions, but it's really served us well, particularly with, a larger complex motion.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that pricing bit reminds me of a conversation I had with Todd Capone here on this podcast, where he was talking about the different levers of negotiating. Right? He's got a new book about that, but basically how good are we at maintaining the discipline of negotiating when we're doing a commercial transaction with a customer? So let me just review what those 4 questions were. Number 1, has the economic buyer explicitly confirmed budget for next year? So we want to know, is there a pocket of money out there that we still have access to? Is this still a funded initiative? Yep. Very important. I'm going to come back to that one. Number 2 is, can you name internal priorities that might be competing with our renewal? So these are not necessarily things that would be either or, but they're things that take up brain space and they take up initiative. They take air out of the room. So if everyone's all worried about something over here, does that mean that we somehow are going to move down the priority list? Is what I understand from that one. Yeah. And then the third one is, do we have clarity on the specific outcomes that the customer is using and basically measuring us on? So do we know what those outcomes are? And presumably we want those to be very specific, and we want those to be measurable, and we want to be able to show them back to the customer. And then the fourth one that you mentioned is, if this deal pushed, what would be the reason? And you said pushed. Does that also include if this deal didn't happen, or is this only if it got pushed time-wise?
Yeah, generally when I renewals more than not, when they push, they, if you're finding out at the end of the quarter that somebody's not going to renew, like you missed a big step somewhere earlier in the process, right? But generally pushed, meaning that renewal, lingers into the next month or the next quarter. And unfortunately I've had situations like that. Same with, a cross-sell or an upsell opportunity. And, sometimes that goes away, and sometimes it gets back to other priorities and things that I used to always tell my team is, our customers don't renew software every day. Our customers don't buy software every day. They may do it once a year.
They have day jobs. Right? Yeah. They have other things that they're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. And frankly, they don't care if it comes in on time or not. And so, I think it's important it's almost like you're serving as a coach to your champion to think about, what are some of those other priorities? What are some of those other initiatives? A great example of another priority that took a lot of the air out of the room was working with a life science company who's getting ready to launch a new drug that was directly tied to the pandemic 3 years ago. So as you imagine, that's going to take priority over everything. That was like an all hands on deck moment. And so, to navigate things like that, you just have to be ready for those. But, to your point earlier, good news or bad news doesn't get better with time. And so getting it out early and communicating it gives you time to react to it as well.
Let's go back to this first question. Has the economic buyer explicitly confirmed a budget? So one of the problems that account managers have is actually figuring out who is the economic buyer, who owns the budget, like literally, like whose bank account is this coming out of? Yeah. And it can be very hard because you may have a champion who's kind of a decision maker, but not a budget owner. And so you think of that person as the boss, but the real boss is kind of, one or two levels up. So how do you coach your teams to identify and then get to and then converse with this economic buyer?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's really understanding who's who in the zoo, right? So who's your champion? Who's the budget owner? And a lot of times what I've seen is you'll have shared budget where IT will fund part of it and the line of business will fund part of it. And so now that makes your work even more challenging because you have multiple stakeholders. And so, I talked about that joint success plan, and that's not only about understanding the priorities, but that's understanding the who's who in the zoo and understanding who are your champions, who are your stakeholders, who are your budget owners. And then also, how do we map people on our team to those, right? And I've had a lot of success in probably the last 5 years is I've started to engage my CFO in conversations with maybe a VP of finance at our customer or the CFO at our customer because they were the ultimate budget owner, right? And so having those two have a connection and just build a relationship and doing it well in advance of any compelling event, being it a renewal or an opportunity, helps a lot too. But really understanding, who's doing what. I grew up on, the challenger sales methodology. And, that's a big proponent of that approach is understanding the different roles and, who's your champion versus who's your blocker and who's a budget owner. And how do you map those different roles to your overall strategy as you're managing a renewal process, as you're managing, a significant expansion opportunity. And I think by doing that, what I've also found is a lot of your contacts, they may not know that. They may need to go find out like who truly owns the budget, right?
For sure. Yeah.
And because it may be 3 levels up within their organization. And so you want to find that out before you've started to produce any paper. And that'll save you a lot of angst down the road.
So let's bring this back to what we were to the theme here of the conversation, which has been forecast. Now, John, when you're aiming, so you just described this process, the 4 questions. You talked about how we want to go through this to reduce our risk and make sure we have clear visibility. What is your ultimate goal as a leader in terms of the forecast? Like, how tight are you trying to get it? I've had people here tell me that they're trying to get to within plus or minus 3%. Is that right?
Wow, that's
what's your experience been?
That's been pretty tight. I mean, so what I would do is I'll kind of step back and I'll look at my number for the year, right? So let's say that I've got a $1 million number for the year. If you break that up into 4 quarters, that's 250,000 in terms of new revenue. And so I take my quarterly number. Usually a month before I started that new quarter, I'd sit down with my leadership team and understand, okay, how does the pipeline support that, right? Do we have a 2 to 3x pipeline to cover that number? And when you're 3 to 4 months out of the end of that quarter, there's a lot of variability, right? I want to make sure we have the pipeline coverage. And then as those deals start to take form and start to take shape, you understand at the deal level which ones are commit versus which ones are best case versus maybe which ones are probable, right? And so I like to have, overage or extra coverage to get to my number. My goal is to get to my number. I'm telling my boss, I'm going to deliver $250,000. Here's my path, I'm going to get there. And I've got some buffer in the event that a deal slips out. I can bring a deal in. And if everything aligns, I might deliver $350,000 for the quarter, right? And so how I think about it, it's the art and the science, right? It's the science is, do the numbers support your number going into the quarter? And then the art is, as the deals move and take form, and we start to really put it through the rigor and asking those probing questions, and we have confidence in making a deal that's in commit, it stays in commit. And then how do we build upon that and build that? So, I mean, 3% is pretty darn aggressive. I would say I'm probably more 5 to 10%.
Okay.
But I'd say that number probably closes by having some of those best case deals that you can move into commit when the timing is right. But I also, like to give my CRO some benefit. He may keep something in his back pocket. We may keep the commit at 250 in that example, knowing we may have some stuff that if we get really creative and we accelerate it, we may have some coverage because he may need that coverage to cover something else on another team as well.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, right, because the post sale, the existing customers are going to generate the bulk of the revenue any quarter anyway, and so we may need to pull some of that in to smooth over other gaps, especially given the current state of new business sales, which is getting very, very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, okay, so I got a good sense of how all that stuff works. What are you tending to look at otherwise, besides the discipline and the process that you just talked about? So everyone these days is trying to say, what kind of dashboards do I have? What kind of AI do I have? What kind of health scores do I have? How much truck do you put into those?
It's a great question, and I'm like most of us are still trying to figure out where does AI come into play and how can it inform us, right? I think what it can do is help aggregate data and help present data in the right way to make decisions. I'm still kind of an old school guy. I like my reports in Salesforce and my dashboards, and that gives me visibility into the right areas, and then we can go dig deeper into those areas. And we've talked a lot about forecasting the business for renewals and, expansion opportunities. I think an area that I've learned probably in the last 10 years and have started to do is also forecast churn, right? So a lot of people they'll manage a health score, they'll manage, red, yellow, green accounts and kind of hope for the best. And I've gotten into a discipline where I'll sit down with my FP&A team, 3 months before the start of the next fiscal year. And we'll map out, because they'll build churn into their overall revenue forecast. And so we'll go through literally at the account level in many cases and say, here's what we think is likely in terms of a churn forecast. Here's where we may have some issues. And we'll manage it. So it's really kind of the inverse activity of managing a expansion forecast. And so when we got into a discipline and a cadence where we were doing this every other week with a cross-functional leadership team, and the impact that it had is we took our gross retention from 88% to 94% in 2 quarters. And because we put the focus, we put the rigor on that. And the thing that was very apparent is this just isn't an account management problem or a CS problem. It's a company problem, right? Because a lot of times people make decisions on your product or your service. And those are things that we can't directly inform in the account management seat. And so by bringing that to the cross-functional teams, that forecasting motion, has served really well. And so you can plug some of those holes in a leaky bucket. That means your top line revenue is going to grow that much better. So,
all right. So this is very interesting, and we didn't have this level of I wasn't prepared for this level, like further level on a churn forecast. So we were talking about how do you forecast, how do you make the number that you're committing for the quarter, but then you're talking about something different, which is a basically company-wide effort meeting every 2 weeks to get into the forecast of the churn. Literally back up, tell us more about that, because that's really, really cool.
Yeah. So, this was at an organization that I joined. We had a couple things going on. We had, we were stagnant with our gross retention in the mid 80s. And so I joined to build out a customer success / account management team. And
by the way, mid 80s gross retention is sort of lower middle of the road. So it's it's not terrible, but it's not great.
Right. And we knew we could do better. And we knew it would take a little bit of time too, but it would take some focus and some focused energy across the board because, some of it was product driven, some of it was service driven, some of it was, it was things on their side where we just had to get creative and restructure the agreement to help them weather the storm of, some tough financial times. And so, but we didn't have a collective alignment of cross-functional teams and primarily cross-functional leaders that were all looking at the same dashboard, that were all focused in on the same thing. And so what I started to do is I started to manage it at my team level. And then as I would bring this up on a monthly basis with my ELT, and we made the quick decision that we need to better operationalize this and meet every 2 weeks, with the head of product, the head of support, the head of professional services, head of engineering, and get all the right people that can influence some of these issues and put things in place before they become revenue churn or customer churn. And so, it was something that, as I mentioned, we went from 85% when I left the organization, we we're at 96% gross retention,
which is super solid. Super solid. Yeah.
Yeah. Dramatically changed. So yeah, we went from kind of okay to, I would say, best in class.
Okay, cool. All right. So then that's something that we haven't talked about very much on this podcast, just generally speaking, are these cross-functional teams to really get a handle on this type of churn. Because as you're saying, there are things that as a post-sale team, we can deal with, right? There are things that we can influence. And then there's a whole bunch of things that we can't. But there's some stuff that we can't influence, but we can go back to our team, to our company and say, hey, let's fix all this stuff. So,
yeah.
So how do we do that? That's a really good answer to this. I like it. I like it a lot. So that we're getting closer and closer, because at the end of the day, the rest of the company wants post sales to be easy and predictable. They want it to just work, right? They think rightly so that sales is very difficult. It's harder to bring in a new customer. They know that a lot of effort goes into that. And they think, once we have a customer, I just want it to maximize lifetime value and do our best and, stay with us for life. And, and that's the idea, is that the revenue from existing customers is the base for compounding growth. It is the durable part of revenue. And so when we do things like what you're talking about here, we're getting closer to that goal. Like we're smoothing out the ups and downs. We're making the entire business more predictable for our leadership team and our investors and our board and so on. And that then makes us look good because it makes us look smart, and we're helping and we're contributing to the success of the company. Did you follow my logic? Did that logic make sense?
100%. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And it's very well said.
Well, no, I mean, a lot of people a lot of leaders still don't connect the dots in this way, right?
Yeah.
People get overwhelmed. They're working on the day-to-day. They're in the trenches on, sometimes working on deal by deal or escalations. There's things that are happening. And we forget the bigger picture of why are we here? Well, we're here to make sure that all this revenue that the sales team captured actually gets delivered, and that we do it in as smooth a way as possible, and that we don't have surprises as we go, so that we can run the business as a well-oiled machine. We're taking the chaos out of post-sales, but a lot of people still aren't, making those connections. So what is your advice when you're talking to a leader, when you think about this yourself, to put all those pieces together so you can both keep the big picture and the day-to-day in your mind?
That's a great perspective. And so, as we know, B2B SaaS is a team sport, right? It takes all of the respective teams, both customer facing and, internal teams, to really be working in a, succinct rhythm, in order to be a successful company, and customers can feel that. And so I think the importance of that cross-functional, engagement, be it, looking at a proactive churn forecast, be it looking at customer health, and shoot, I've got 10 red accounts that I need help on 8 of them from engineering, or, the same with, yellow accounts as well. I think what it does is it helps you take a step back to understand at a thematic level, what are the issues that are causing angst with our customers, right? And so is it product related? The product isn't delivering what you told me it was going to deliver when we initially bought it. It could be people related. I just don't have a good fit of somebody that's helping me implement my solution. But what that does is it helps you take a step back and look at it across your customer base and really understand the sentiment of your customers and understand what's working well and what's not. And then as you get into those specific, you're really getting into the day-to-day, the ground level details of how to fix that problem. But what I found was having that dialogue every 2 weeks, you're going to run across that same issue again at some point, right? And that could be a product issue, that could be a service issue, whatever that is. And so having that ongoing dialogue, hopefully you can start to see the pattern and get ahead of it before it happens. And so that's, to me, where the real magic comes in place, where you're starting to anticipate issues, right? And so, as an example, we implemented this healthcare client and they had this issue because there's a government regulation related to this data set, right? And so guess what? 4 months later, we've got another healthcare customer that has a similar need. Let's get ahead of it before it becomes an issue. And so I think that's when things are working well, is when you're starting to be proactive and you're not just reactive. I think the other thing, and I'm sure you've heard this a bunch too, particularly at the ground level, you feel like you're siloed in organizations, right? If you're in account management, you're completely separated from, consulting or engineering or product or support. And, this type of engagement does is it breaks down those barriers, breaks down those silos, because you're now working as a collective team, for the betterment of your customer and for their overall journey.
Now, last question as we wrap it up here. How do you keep the executive team focused on this? Because I can imagine that there was a time when you're like, yeah, let's do these meetings every 2 weeks. And they're all like, yeah, let's do it. And then, their attention drifts and other things pop up and there are a million other priorities. But for this kind of thing to work, it's got to get built into the operating cadence of the company. So how did you make that stick?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I've been very fortunate to the CEO that I've worked with a couple of times and CRO are very supportive of this type of approach. I think they realize the impact that, the customer-based teams have on revenue, both new revenue, existing revenue, and protecting existing revenue, but also preventing churn. And so they understand the benefit of that and have helped sponsor those initiatives to ensure that in these cases, I had the right resources to participate. But, over time, everybody gets busy. Everybody has, their own escalations to deal with and issues to deal with. And so, what we used to do is we would meet every 2 weeks. Obviously, you're going to have people that, may have to step out. And, I would even personally sometimes go debrief them for 15 minutes. And here's what we covered. Here's where I need your help. And so, but what we would also do is our executive team would meet on a weekly basis and we would roll up our churn forecast into that executive pack that they would review at their ELT. So it always stayed top of mind. And I think even for the executive team, they could connect the dots on the work that we were doing at the SLT level. They could connect that at the company level, and even share that in board conversations as well with board members, because, my CEO was talking to board members weekly, right? And they were wanting to know, hey, what's around the corner? Is there going to be any surprises this quarter, any churn that we should be aware of? And so by keeping them aware and educating them, I think once you get into that rhythm and that cadence and they see benefit out of it, they'll make sure that it stays intact.
Awesome. Well, hey, John Huber, thanks for coming on, man. Really appreciate it. Good to have this real deep dive into the art and science of forecasting and helping all of our post-sales friends perform at the absolutely best level. So really glad to have you here.
I appreciate it, Alex. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.